Okay, hello everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. And welcome to this webinar hosted by the Thomas Ashton Institute for Risk and Regulation at the University of Manchester. My name is Connie Smith, and I'm one of the co-conveners of the Building Safety Network, and I will be chairing today's event. So just to explain briefly the format, as you can see, this is set up as a webinar, which means that any question or comments you have need to go in the Q&A function, which hopefully you can see along the top of the Teams webinar window. So we'll get to questions at the end, but feel free to write them in at any point. So today, just to explain briefly the format, we'll briefly have an introduction to the Thomas Ashton Institute from Professor Neil Bourne. Then Dr. Ian Tellem will present on the main body of the webinar, which will be around culture change in the construction sector. We're really delighted that Professor James Evans is going to be our discussant today, so he'll offer a few words, and then we'll open it up to questions, which I will read out from the Q&A box. So firstly, then, I would like to introduce Professor Neil Bourne, who is Director of the Thomas Ashton Institute, and he'll briefly say a bit about its work and the background to the Building Safety Network. So over to you, Neil.
Great. Thank you, Connie. A real pleasure to be here this morning, and a real pleasure to see such a number of disciplines and a great number of people who are interested in what is a very real problem for the built environment in the UK. We know that there are problems that have started many years ago that inherit in the system that haven't been properly addressed. And the Health and Safety Executive was in 2022 given the goal of trying to introduce a building safety regulatory system. We in the Ashton Institute are in partnership with the Health and Safety Executive, particularly looking at gathering and analysing the evidence across the building safety landscape. And I would say that the cross-disciplinary nature of what we do and the people that we have within this group are really going to allow us to push that agenda forward and contribute to HSE and the UK government's attitude to this very real problem. So with that, thank you very much for attending, and I'll pass you back to Connie.
Thanks very much. Great. So I would then like to welcome Dr. Ian Tellem, who's going to be presenting today on culture change in the construction sector, and he has been leading some of the work that the Building Safety Network has been doing in this area. Ian is a social anthropologist and a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Manchester. His previous PhD research focused on the adoption of novel technologies such as robotics and AI for nuclear decommissioning, with a focus on the barriers to innovation and organisational change within a highly regulated and risk-averse industry. Following on from this, his current work looks at the role of regulation and risk management in the construction industry and efforts to encourage culture change across the sector. So Ian, over to you.
Thank you, Connie. Just get my first slide up. Bear with me a second. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that. Yeah, great. Okay, yes, so thank you, Connie. As I said, I'm Ian. I'm a postdoctoral research associate of anthropology, currently working with the Building Safety Network. So thank you everyone for attending today. Let's start the presentation. So there are various aspects of building safety, various legal aspects, and these are all important, but it's not what I'll be addressing today specifically. Today I'll be talking more about the cultural aspects of safety, how the construction sector has been criticised in recent years for the prevailing culture, looking a bit at what the sort of things need to change and how, in order that these cultural issues won't hold back some of the moves to building and maintaining buildings that are safe for residents to live in, and how the sector might begin to earn the trust of residents back. So to start with, the piece of legislation this talk will largely be orbiting around is the Building Safety Act. What is it? What does it hope to achieve? And what are the limits of what it can achieve? So let's start there. Why do we need a Building Safety Act? What prompted it? While over recent years there have been various concerns about the state of building safety in the UK, it was really the Grenfell fire that brought it to the fore, certainly in the public consciousness. It's demanded action and legislative action from the government, and it got called a broken system even by Michael Gove. So you have a couple of issues there, at least. You have faulty legislation and you have a broken system. So how does the government begin to address these issues? Well, the most prominent piece of legislation to come out of the crisis has been the Building Safety Act. And as a piece of legislation, it codifies the government's response to the crisis and is out there to garner criticism and review, as it should. It's still early on in the BSA's life, but there's already been some criticism of it, including that it's too vague in some respects, that it doesn't go far enough in some others, like the exact height of the buildings to which it applies, for instance, that maybe it's not addressing the right questions and concerns that people have over building safety, which means it might not actually benefit those who are most affected by the problems, such as residents and leaseholders. Maybe it makes it worse for them. We've seen this with the cladding remediation scheme costs getting passed down the chain to leaseholders, putting them not just in an unsafe building, but sometimes in a state of financial ruin as well. Central to today's point, Helen Carr, who's been working with the Building Safety Network, argues more broadly that the legislative changes that the BSA represents have failed to do what they've really set out to do, which is to bring an overhaul, a radical change in the institutional culture of the UK construction sector. So the so-called broken system that people are exploiting, in the words of Michael Gove. There's not been a paradigm shift of the sort that's required. Rather, the legislative changes that the Building Safety Act represents are just another incremental step well within the normal frame of the way that the sector as a whole operates. So it's a typically top-down legislative approach to an issue that requires a bottom-up or grassroots change. So this call for culture change in the sector, something which is the primary topic of today's section, something that's very much expressed in the Hackett Review. These are all sort of random snippets of the number of times it comes up. So it's an overarching theme rather than just addressing various specifics and technical aspects that the review and the subsequent report identify. It's identified that culture within the construction industry wasn't conducive to building safety. And if things were to dramatically change as they needed to, this couldn't happen without this sort of deep-seated change in the culture of the sector. So I'll be talking about what would be required, what sort of thinking needs to be employed to engender culture change within an organisation or an industry or sector, and why that's incredibly difficult to do. Why legislation such as the Building Safety Act can only have a limited effect on this, and how we might potentially want to start looking at ways that we might address this. What sorts of approaches could we be taking that we aren't already? So disasters of various sorts, natural or man-made, are events which prompt societal reflection. They can be termed as points of rupture within a societal system, which up until that point has on the surface been ticking along nicely. And various social and political scholars have looked at disasters as an impetus into societal reflection and change. Often the state, as the entity that's supposed to look after its citizens, is implicated in some way, and there'll be calls for the state to look at the way it does things. How can it have done things better? Where did it all go wrong? Etc. Whether it's a pandemic or financial crash or a major fire. And the official mechanisms by which this happens are inquiries and reviews, often leading to legislation, because that's the mechanism by which the government enacts itself. In the case of the Grenfell fire, this official mechanism was the independent review of building regulations and fire safety, led by Dame Judith Hackett, and it highlighted several key areas of failure. Firstly, a lack of responsibility and accountability. There were a lack of clear roles and responsibilities in the sector, and it stressed a need for a culture where everyone involved in the construction process is responsible and accountable for their actions. Competence and training. Over the review, there emerged an apparent lack of competence in the industry, so better training and qualifications were called for. There was a lack of collaboration and communication, needed to be a more coherent, integrated and joined up culture to improve standards of safety. And overall, there was an attitude towards compliance which aims for attaining minimum standards. Safety should be a fundamental principle, not just a regulatory requirement, suggested the report. So there was also a lack of transparency and engagement with residents. As the report said, residents should be involved in the decision-making process regarding the safety of their homes, and this wasn't happening. But through all this, there was this overarching theme that the thing which should underpin excuse me, improvement in all these areas was culture change. And Hackett points to a cultural issue across the sector, which can be described as a race to the bottom, caused either through ignorance, indifference, or because the system does not facilitate good practice. And to address this, we need to drive culture change in the sector. So what does culture change mean, and how do you drive it? What even is a culture really? So it's one thing to identify cultural problems, but actually then trying to change the culture of an organisation or an entire sector can be one of the most difficult organisational tasks to actually do. This is to a large extent because cultures are stabilising forces in social systems. They generate group identities, ideas of practices, behaviours and attitudes which are considered beneficial for the collective. They define the group and its identity in a way and evolve over time from all sorts of internal, external stimuli in order to do this, which means that cultures are highly durable. So how far can you really expect to meaningfully change a culture through a legislative intervention such as the Building Safety Act? So any set of regulations such as this is an act of control. It's looking to set limits on behaviours and ensure that the level of risk is minimised. The sort of risk management issue is something which originally takes its cue from the financial sector and insurance, with the use of market insurance to protect individuals and companies from various losses associated with accidents. So it's a matter of deciding what level of risk is acceptable, what sort of risk is tolerable. So that's a systematic way to go about the management of risk. But what an approach of setting a risk limit or probability of something going wrong lacks is the fact that life and the world are evolving processes with interactions between people, the environment happening all the time, and new things are emerging all the time. If you're coming up with a particular scenario and then trying to work out the best way to minimize the occurrence of that scenario, you may end up with a hyper-focused or tunnel vision view. You're not generally trying to interact with the emergent social realities you're looking to govern, at least not habitually. And this can result in a lack of feedback regarding problems. And we can see this in Grenfell, where concerns of residents were overlooked or shut down because they weren't part of the safety system of feedback, and they lacked weight and influence to affect the processes that were affecting their own homes. And that's not peculiar to the case of Grenfell either. So because concepts of building standards are based on the idea of risk and risk mitigation, discussions around legislation tend to be about where to set these standards, what's tolerable or not, as well as how best to enforce them. How much red tape should there be or not be? It's this view of safety and risk from the perspective of government, lawmakers, legislators, based on a particular calculus that, while it has its merits, it does tend to delimit the discussion to certain particular areas, which then frames the type of response that you get to a crisis. As Cartwright here states, in the face of disaster or crisis change, in the face of a disaster, crisis or crisis, culture change is exogenally induced through a crisis in the status quo and endogenously mitigated through existing institutions in their broader context. So calls for culture change come from the outside, but the internal mechanisms that become responsible for enacting this change inevitably carve the solution in their own image. Remember that cultures really represent the status quo and achieve their status of being an identifiable culture by being durable and by being able to mitigate changes. So to what extent can the Building Safety Act induce culture change, and to what extent does its nature as a work of bureaucracy mitigate this? Just to emphasize, I'm not saying you shouldn't make bureaucratic and legislative changes, but just that the scope of what can be achieved with that sort of approach is limited, and potentially in some ways you could reinforce existing cultural norms and values instead of overturning them. So there's plenty of cases in political history, for instance, where slight reform along acceptable lines to the establishment can maintain existing power structures without overturning them, because it limits the degree of change. That's especially true when internal pressures are operating on the system from within. Existing risk factors, which include commercial risk, financial risk, political risk, are processed through entrenched patterns of thinking in the group, and deviation from ingrained procedure and ideology can make people anxious, cautious, or even resistant. So you have the Building Safety Act, which is operating through existing bureaucratic mechanisms, attempting to induce change on the industry externally, but also while it's not doing anything to alleviate internal pressures and other pressures which might cause resistance or pushback. So how does the Building Safety Act, for instance, address the cultural norm that involves doing the bare minimum, rather than it just setting a new standard for what the bare minimum is? It doesn't begin to ask the question as to why this cultural trait exists, and therefore it doesn't begin to address it, and so on. So you can find other examples along these lines. It's a tool, but it's not the tool that you do that particular thing with. So how do you foster a culture with a better focus on safety and resident safety? What incentives or disincentives are there for positive change? In what way does the bill invoke long-term aspirational ideas of building and consequently resident safety? So this language of aspirations and ideas can seem a bit lofty, but they perform important roles in culture change. They provide a particular imaginary to which the current situation can be compared, and they can align stakeholder thought through a common goal across group boundaries. It can be a template of sorts, which itself provides a frame in which to make political decisions. The Building Safety Act is one sort of framing device. It's a set of ideas, a way of going about things, which is an evolution of ideas with roots in the liberalisation of building regulation towards the end of the 20th century. Ideas like cutting red tape built on concepts of flexibility, agility, competitiveness, which themselves form an aspirational framework in which political and policy decisions are made. You can see it in some of the writing like this. It's about the golden thread system that's planned to manage the administrative side of the legislation, where they don't want to be too prescriptive, they don't want to be a burden on industry or limit innovation. And there are lots of ideas out there in the marketplace of ideas that do similar things like sustainability, net zero, resilience, and innovation, which might start out as buzzwords, but their existence as concepts provide avenues of thought, goals, wrapping up complex ideas in a way that's easier to act upon or towards. And it's important to give these ideas name and form, but also as they pass through the various grids of cultural constructs within an institution, they can become attenuated or repurposed or co-opted to fit in line with existing goals. So what about the idea of safety or safety culture? What sort of idea is this? What sort of aspiration? Has it been compromised into a kind of system of risk management accountancy and lost its effectiveness or its potency as something to aspire to? When we talk about safety, the safety of residents in their home, in this case, what does it mean? What can it mean? And what can you do about it anyway? So one of the other aspects that has come up a lot when it comes to building safety, and this comes up in the Hackett report, is trust. How can we get residents to trust the industry, the legislators, the government? So trust isn't really a matter of doing something and then someone trusts you. It's a reciprocation based on people's experience over time. You can build it, but you can't just generate it. And much of the lack of trust derives from a lack of agency, with residents feeling disenfranchised because they are disenfranchised. Literally, they're unable in many cases to have their voices heard because they lack power and agency. As things stand, they're treated as if they're on the outside of the system. They're one of those external factors putting pressure on the system, but they're not treated as integrated within it. And really, doing so isn't just a matter of occasionally checking in on them or trying to base policy decisions only on what would be presumed will be good for residents, but maybe better integrated in the process of planning and design all the way through to the maintenance and ongoing development of these spaces, and proactively making moves to do so. Oops, sorry. So one quote I like is from the anthropologist Tim Ingold here when talking about the idea of homes. Is this its indwelling that we build? Homes are not completely built until someone is living their life in them. And if we want to build successful residential buildings, we need to empower residents to contribute to this process of home building. So to summarize, it needs to be acknowledged that a piece of legislation on its own can only go so far into building an enduring safety culture in the sector. It's likely that the new legislation of this sort will maybe force the industry to comply in some ways, but not on its own to go beyond the bare minimum as before, and will do little to shift industry culture as is declared necessary by Hackett Review. Also, leaseholders and residents need to be better integrated in the processes. They're not just the subjects of changes, but agents of them too. Developing this relationship is what's actually going to build trust over time. So we need to broaden the concepts of safety, or how we make things safe, beyond simply, does it meet criteria X? That's part of it, but it doesn't by itself create a culture which promises or works towards safety as an ideal or a goal. If we go back to the idea that homemaking is an ongoing process, it's linked to living a life, we need to engage with that aspect of dwelling better, both in terms of individual experience and with groups and communities. And how to do this is by calling for greater integration with different types of research, different types of data, ways of collecting and incorporating that data. And that means much closer interdisciplinary engagement with social sciences and engineering, arts and humanities, etc., areas of study for which these aspects are the object of study. So a large part of what the Building Safety Network is trying to do is look at these areas of research and build bridges between different silos of scholarship that can exist, and start these conversations which have a different perspective, a different viewpoint on what safety is and can be for residents, or potentially building users of any sort, schools, hospitals, prisons, and so on. Anthropology of the built environment, for instance, meeting with engineering to expand on what can be done and induce change in the sector. So yeah, this is still early on in the process, but you have to start somewhere, and building those networks and beginning that engagement is vital to begin to grow a school of thought with a more holistic approach to safety across the sector. So that's all for now. So thanks for listening and starting this conversation with us. I think we'll be moving on to some questions from James and your own questions. So you'll have some time to think about what you want to ask. Shall I leave that up there, Connie, for now?
Yes, please. Let's leave it up for a moment. So thanks very much, Ian. That was really fantastic. So while everyone is formulating their questions, and encourage you to put them in the chat, I'm really delighted to welcome Professor James Evans to be our discussant. James is Professor of Human Geography at the University of Manchester, and he's currently Director of the Manchester Urban Institute. His research focuses on sustainable urban development and smart cities. He has a long-standing interest in the relationship between environmental science and urban thought, particularly in terms of how organising concepts such as resilience and systems thinking structure contemporary approaches to cities. So following James's words, we'll then open up to questions. So please do crack on with putting them in the Q&A box. So over to you, James.
Thanks ever so much, Connie, and thank you, Ian, for that thought-provoking talk. As Connie says, my background is more focusing on urban sustainability. So if you like, a little bit of a broader kind of zoomed out view on buildings, but I've become particularly interested in processes of governance, how you coordinate large, diverse groups of actors towards some kind of shared goal. And I thought it was really interesting, Ian, that you put up that list that included building safety, but it included net zero, it included sustainability, it included resilience. These are all kind of broad societal goals I think most people would agree are valid and worthwhile pursuing. but that there are challenges in coordinating a very vast and diverse set of actors towards achieving them. It was also a pleasure hearing a little bit more about the role of culture in organizational change. Again, something I've come to focus on more and more has been organizations and how they change. Much of my work focuses on cities, how we change cities to make them more sustainable. I'm increasingly of the belief that if you want to change physical infrastructure, you need to change the organizations that deliver it. And I think this focus on culture in terms of how organizations operate and how organizations can be shaped going forward is potentially a really valuable one. That's enough about me. I've got, I guess, 3 topics in no particular order that jumped out at me here. One is around how distinct the construction sector is compared to other sectors. So it is vast, it is diverse, but then other sectors are too. One thing that struck me about safety is we often look at the aviation industry or the rail industry for best practice around safety. And they're rather simpler systems where the feedback between accidents and the changes that need to be made to avoid future accidents like that are really quite clear and direct. They're not in the construction sector. Decades can go past. It can be really hard to figure out what went wrong originally. This got me thinking about other types of building safety as well, that kind of grey area between a building falling down or catching fire at one end with just a building that's constructed poorly and becomes damp over the course of a few decades and causes persistent chronic health problems for inhabitants that come through. Is that part of building safety as well? And that brings me to the kind of second point about the long-term nature of this. Part of the challenge in the construction sector is they produce products that are used and inhabited intimately by people over the long term. And there's just misaligned priorities there between developing selling a profitable product and creating something that will persist and last and be safe over decades. And of course, I did some work years ago on public-private partnerships. And one of the promise of them was they'd get over these misaligned priorities because the people who paid to build the building would then be operating the service in the building. So we'd have some kind of stake in making sure the building was fit for purpose and didn't fall down or make anyone sick. That was a different governance arrangement that tried to invest the people who built things in their long-term operation. That hasn't panned out too well either, but for a bunch of other reasons. And the final thing I guess it makes me reflect on, and again, going back to the parallels with sustainability, is often what we see getting built is around the race to the bottom, is around minimal compliance. And yet I sit in meetings with developers all the time who really want to do more innovative projects. They want to build developments that have lots of green space, that enhance residents' mental health, that enable communities to flourish. But they often can't. Again, the system, whatever we're talking about, when we talk about the system, doesn't seem capable of fully valuing or rewarding those kinds of decisions. And there's lots of potential opportunities around that, around ESG investing, which is, developers are again trying to unlock pension fund money to invest in developments that have a longer term focus, deliver more kinds of co-benefits, but we're still a long way off. What we see mostly in practice is things being built that would look similar to most people from 30 years ago. So there's a challenge there. And I guess the final thing I found really interesting around the talk was how to involve residents in these discussions. And again, this has been a broader trend across all urban planning across the last 30 years around collaborative planning involving communities in decisions that affect them. And from the other side, as you noted, Ian, from the risk management side, risk is to some extent socially constructed. People can help mitigate risk through their specific local knowledge. The question, as always, comes down to how to do it. And in the construction sector, I think who should do it? Are we saying construction companies should develop the capabilities to engage communities? Often it's done through third parties, housing associations, management companies. That there are challenges to where people put trust. So people do tend to have slightly higher trust in government than private companies. They certainly still, luckily, have higher trust in universities too. But that question around trust immediately makes me think, who should be doing it? Do we need the right kind of intermediaries to do it? So sorry, Ian, I just threw a bunch of stuff at you there. I guess the final thing, given your previous work on different sectors, is just how does this look compared to other sectors from your point of view? Is this a unique challenge for the building and construction sector? Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, James. Ian, would you like to respond to some of these?
Sure, I'm just going to take the slide off down there a second, because
that'd be great.
See my face a bit better and I can see you. Thanks, James. There's lots of things there to address. I'll kind of address that last point along with other ones, I think, as well, because it's an important aspect of the construction sector as a whole, I think, and it kind of speaks a little bit to the first point you made with how distinct the construction sector is compared to other industries. You compared it to the aviation industry or other kind of exemplars where safety is paramount. My experience is with the nuclear industry, mostly, rather than the construction industry. Obviously, other people in the building safety network have other fields of greater depth of expertise in that. So I'm coming from one industry and kind of comparing it a little bit with how things are. And there are definitely differences between something like the nuclear sector or whatever compared to the construction sector. And I think one of the things which I'm kind of learning is how diverse the construction industry is. And, you know, with some of the feedback I've had, how it's hard to delineate a singular construction sector culture as opposed to a culture of many subcultures. And going in, you know, one of the things you could critique the Hackett report about was trying to treat the industry as if it's maybe more monolithic than it actually is in some ways. So I think when you're talking about how distinct it is, as well as what makes it a unique challenge potentially, is in part, is this diversity? So you can't necessarily take a plan for culture change that may have worked in another sector and apply it to this, you know. So so the point of this presentation isn't necessarily to do that, rather to begin having those conversations, because and create those connections where those ideas or become shared between different people where they weren't before, and begin those conversations and so forth. So it is a challenge for which I don't necessarily have answers for, but the point is to begin looking into it, researching it, and finding out ways in which that could be done. Because it is vast and diverse, and it is, I mean, I wouldn't say it's different from every other sector, but it is not as bound necessarily as something like nuclear industry, which is sort of insular in some ways, not entirely, but, you know, has its own particular issues to it and other issues where safety is paramount as well. The other thing that I noticed you said, which is a parallel in some ways to my experiences in my previous work, was that how developers actually want to improve, like you say. You know, they're not trying to embody these kind of do the minimum type things. There's an appetite for improving these things, and that's something which, again, in my previous work was notable, because quite often it can be easy to say, oh, people just don't want to do it because they're selfish or lazy or greedy or whatever it is. But when you actually start collecting the data and so forth, you'll find that that narrative doesn't match up with necessarily what the data is. So again, I'm leaning on this more because I know more about it, but innovation in the nuclear sector was considered to be kind of slow, and people were supposed to be resistant to change. But actually, most of the people across various levels of the organisation were enthusiastic towards it. Turns out that, as you say, it's the system which they're working in which does very little to incentivise those sorts of things, and is full of procedures and so forth that just make these things difficult and discourage, in the end, doing things differently and doing things in a new way. And I would tend towards, rather than just directly trying to enforce culture change on someone, you need to look at how the system works and what it does to disincentivize these kind of more progressive attitudes and so forth. And that's something which I wanted to mention in this presentation, was that there are other pressures on organizations which can act to mitigate this. You know, commercial risk, financial risk, you can't just necessarily forget them and go in one direction. But, you know, how can you take all these pressures across the industry and the various subcultures and something as a whole, and see how you can maybe align some of these things to incentivize things which work in a more safety conscious way, which work more for the benefit of residents and building users of all sorts, depending on what the building's for. So yeah, those are important points to mention, that it's a very diverse industry doesn't have one monolithic culture, that people are probably more willing to embrace change. There's no reason really not to, as long as everything else lines up. You know, there's so, you know, don't presume that the resistance comes from a place of necessarily negativity. It's you know, there may be conflicts of interest and things going on there. So it's important to, that's why it's important to bring, I think, people together who can voice these kind of challenges and look at it a bit more deeply. And that's, we might get a chance to mention at the end what we're hoping to do in these workshops coming up and things like that, that we're planning to bring these different perspectives and things together, which I think is important when you're actually trying to get a more holistic picture, as opposed to maybe being judgmental or something. I don't know how you would phrase it, but yeah. So yeah, were there any? So there was quite a lot you said. Did you have any other follow-ups for that, or did we want to open it up to the floor?
No, that's great. That's really interesting, especially hearing your reflections from other sectors, and I think understanding the barriers to innovation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Rich or Neil, is there anything you wanted to add at this stage, either in response to Ian or response to James?
Yeah, happy to say a few words. I think one of the challenges that we face as researchers in attempting to kind of problematize the issues around building safety is the unit of analysis. Residents, buildings, organisations, the construction industry, and the latter, of course, is quite difficult to delineate. You know, what do we actually mean by the construction industry? And I think once we've gained greater clarity in understanding what that means for this network, then we will hopefully be able to target the research that we undertake into ways that enable policy reform, and hopefully start to move the conversation away from buildings to places where sustainable communities can actually thrive. Just to give you an example, we know that local hospitals, for example, the one near me here in York, struggles to recruit staff because of the lack of affordable quality housing for nurses, healthcare assistants and other healthcare professionals that obviously are of limited means. So if we don't have access to that housing, then it means that other critical infrastructures that support our society struggle to maintain a level of service that that society expects. So this systems thinking approach is absolutely crucial, but the way in which government is organised often makes that difficult. And at the ministerial level, it's very clear often that ministers don't wish to talk across briefs, like to talk about their own particular spending review settlement and their own single departmental plans or whatever they're called today. So there is a kind of real systems challenge here, which methodologically I think we understand, but the reality of tackling it is somewhat different. So yeah, I'm really excited that we've got this opportunity now within the network to start to think about some of these issues and support the various agencies in government and devolved regions and local administrations that are looking to improve the quality and availability of housing. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Rich. So it seems like everyone's very shy of the Q&A function. So we've also enabled your microphone. So if anyone has any comments or questions or reflections, perhaps based on your own areas of research or professional practice, we'd be really interested to hear, or anything that you feel like you would like to bring into the conversation. So I think, am I right, Helen, that people can now turn on and off their own microphones?
Yes, they should be able to. There is a question now in the Q&A section from Will Franks.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks, Will. So yes, so Will says, thanks for the talk. Agree with the points around learning from other regulated sectors, but acknowledging the built environment as its own thing that will develop over time. I'm interested if the Building Safety Network has encountered regulatory regimes in other jurisdictions that have achieved a more robust systems safety culture. So I suppose James has maybe touched on this a bit by thinking about aviation, but is there, Ian, is there anything you'd like to add to that from your experience, perhaps with the nuclear industry?
I mean, there's lots I could add, but again, I think you have to define what is meant by a safety culture as well, because the nuclear industry is generally has been very safe, but there's particular issues pertaining to nuclear materials and stuff that make it kind of unique in its own way, especially when you consider things like the time that nuclear materials last for. Something that has been safe in the past, safe now, might not be safe in the future. So safety culture becomes a mixture of containment in that case, like making sure everything at the moment is safe, but also trying to innovate, because in 20, 50 years time or whatever, you need things in place in order to do that. I don't know I mean, there's an element of the construction sector that you could say is kind of similar, because obviously there's the safety culture of building things now, and there's, well, what will the building be like in 30, 40 years time? A lot of yeah, and not just in terms of is the building going to catch fire or fall down or something, but also in terms of the social aspects of building environments and you know, is this going to be a healthy place socially down the line and things like. There's a lot to incorporate into one concept of safety culture, and I think it's important, you know, when you talk about robust systems safety culture, something can be robust in one respect but blind to other things as well. So I think different industries delineate what they consider to be the limits of it's a risk management approach. They delimit what is tolerable and what timescale it's tolerable, and it might be robust within that, but it might be short-sighted or something going towards the future. And I think it's important to, more than creating a robust system, that to realize that this is something that's going to evolve, which is one reason why I wanted to consider more more long-term idea of safety and reassess what safety meant, and how it's more about creating a feedback system where things acknowledge things change over time, and approaches to safety and making things safe again are responsive, and listen to residents, but also anybody else who might have it. So yeah, it's a complicated question, because you have to define what is safe, as well as what is culture, and what defines a safety culture. So I think it's more a matter of creating the systems which incentivize this in a adaptable and reflexive way, rather than just enforcing a regime of safety, a robust stroke rigid regime of safety on a sector. That may have been a bit of a wandering answer, but I think it's a complicated question. So yeah.
No, thank you for that. That's really good, actually. And it does kind of reflect what I've seen as a systems safety practitioner in this space. So I like that you mentioned incentives. We see, obviously, there are legal duties. There are things that have to be done. And we encounter people saying, this is lighter touch than we're already doing. So some of the things like around resident engagement, very, very light touch. And I agree, it would be interesting to see how that develops and go beyond a sort of compliance mindset or a tick box approach, because fundamentally people are doing what they have to do to fulfill the requirements that are on them. So yeah, thank you for that. It's really insightful.
Great, thank you very much, Will, for that. Would anyone else like to come in either by text? I think we have some further questions. Okay, this one from Rosina Ranu, hope I pronounced your name correctly, says, thank you for the session. How would you assess whether culture is changing or not? What would you consider are leading indicators of improvement given how complex the built environment is? That's a really fantastic question, Rosina, and whether our culture is changing or not is one of the big topics in social anthropology. So I'll let Ian handle that one.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, could you just repeat the question quickly again?
How would you assess whether culture is changing or not? So in the safety culture. And what would you consider are leading indicators of improvement given how complex the built environment is? So that might be a question also for the wider Building Safety Network team as well.
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's hard is that obviously this is the sort of thing that's going to see slow change over time, most likely. I don't think you can have an overnight change. I think it's more about having the mechanisms in place that align particular incentives and things in industry. And I think you can see that. I also think, importantly, that one way to see if something is in a healthy position and open to change, at least, is other conversations people are having and how open people are. I think one of the things that did come out of the report and that is that there was much less integration and people weren't talking to each other, which is part of the problem. So I think you may not be able to see culture change quickly as a whole, but you can see the bedrock that has more potential to lead to positive change. I think you can see those mechanisms in place and consider that to be a good start, at least anyway. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I think maybe I could, if it's okay to use my chair's prerogative, to just come in on that a little bit as well, because I think this question about the complexity of the built environment is something that's come up a lot, and how we think about this in a really multifaceted way. And I think that that is something that we're also trying to do by establishing the building safety network in the first place, is to kind of open this up to a different kind of conversation. So I think something that in my work, which is in the anthropology of the built environment and infrastructure, looking at the relationship between really long-term processes of urban change as well as faster forms of intervention and then disasters within that. I think something that I've really taken from the field of disaster risk reduction is the idea of risk accumulation. And this comes back to, I think, what James was saying about, how do we think about these different types of safety within the construction sector? Because risk is cumulative. So questions around, damp and mold and the cumulative effects of that over time are absolutely safety factors if we think about health in its broadest sense, rather than just danger to life as a question of risk. And I think this is the way that this risk accumulation happens. We can see really clearly in terms of vulnerability to disasters of all sorts, where it's something we saw in the pandemic. I think that people who were in particularly precarious housing conditions, whether that's overcrowding or poor quality housing, their risk to contracting the virus and the seriousness of the virus was compounded by those types of housing issues. So I think when we start to think about this in a kind of multi-dimensional way, where we draw on different types of research, different types of experience and professional practice, I think it does at least, that's not necessarily going to give us indicators to start with, but I think it gives us a kind of broader framework for thinking about risk and safety that doesn't delimit it into a question of purely technical expertise around engineering questions, which are obviously absolutely central and important, but we need to think about those in this bigger kind of social, political, health context. And I think, maybe that's a moment too, Ian, if you want to mention the other events that we've got coming up that are going to try and be a bit more, bring this to the fore a bit more in terms of the discussions.
Yeah, so next month, I forget the exact date, but I'm sure somebody will be able to put that in there. But we're planning a couple of workshops in order to start to try to begin these conversations and so forth. And one of the aspects which I believe was important was to get different perspectives from different areas of the sector, all the way from residents, industry, legislators, and so forth, because it's such a diverse potential sector, and because everybody has their own pressures and their own ideas of what the challenges are, what the problems are. The first step to beginning to address these is kind of getting them all these ideas together and working out what the fundamental challenges are that we need to try and start to address. So the first workshop is online in June, and it will be an online, it's an online workshop, and we're asking people from whatever relationship they have with the construction industry to come in and basically, to begin with, just give their opinions as to what particular challenges are and so forth in the industry from their perspective and from their depth of expertise. This will be followed up with an in-person workshop in Manchester the following month, where we'll be getting people together again to look kind of at what the range of issues are that we've developed out of this first workshop, and start looking at the issues more holistically, and ways in which we could begin to approach addressing these, hopefully in a novel way, perhaps. So that's coming up over the next couple of months, and we will notify you of the dates, because I don't have them off the top of my head.
Ian, could you just share your final slide so people can sign up for more?
Oh, yes, certainly.
So yeah, so the next workshop in the series is on the 18th of June. So if you would like to participate, it'd be a lot more interactive than this webinar format. We'll be also hearing from people with experience of these issues in different parts of the sector, as residents, as policymakers, as industry professionals. So to hear more, there's various ways that you can sign up here. So you can use the QR code, you can email us at salient@manchester.ac.uk, and you can also, well, there's also a phone number, but probably we don't need that one. So yes, please do sign up to hear more, or if you just want to hear more about the network as it goes forwards and the kind of work that we're doing. And at the bottom of this slide is a link to the website, which also has the position paper that Ian was speaking to today as well, so you can read in a bit more depth the kind of issues that we are thinking about. Thank you for posting that in the chat. So the next virtual workshop is 18th of June from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. and there's a link there to sign up in the chat. So I think unless anyone else has anything pressing, that seems like we've reached the end of the session. So I would just like to say thank you so much to Dr. Ian Tellem for a really fantastic talk, and also to Professor James Evans for being our discussant today. We really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you to all of you who joined online. I think we had over 50 people participating, so that was really fantastic. And we hope that you have enjoyed it and taken something from it, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in due course. Thanks very much.